Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In this video, we are going to continue practicing with comparisons in Spanish. In particular, we are going to look at the superlative. The superlative is a special type of comparison where one thing surpasses all the others. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I do have two other videos on comparisons. There's comparisons of equality and comparisons of inequality. So if you're studying comparisons in general in Spanish, be sure to go and check out those other videos. You can find them on my channel homepage. Be sure to study the topic in your textbook. Watch that grammar tutorial video. If you're joining us from outside of the class and you don't have any materials, you can just Google the topic, how to make comparisons in Spanish, and you'll find some websites and some great YouTube videos that talk about comparisons and how to make them. When you're ready to practice and review a little bit, then come here. That's what we're going to do. We're going to review a little bit and practice at the same time with the superlative. So an example of the superlative would be in English when we take an adjective and we add est to it. So we use a superlative when we say things like, she is the nicest, or that is the biggest. Sometimes we have an irregular superlative where you can't add the est. For example, interesting, we don't say the interesting est, we rather say the most interesting. So superlatives in Spanish will function structurally like this last one here, the most, and then the adjective. So let's take a look at the formula for making a superlative in Spanish. Whatever it is that you're comparing, you have to take into account the gender and the number of that noun that you're comparing. So, for example, if it is a car, el carro, then you will choose el. If it's a house, la casa, then you'll choose la. If it's the books, los libros, then you'll choose los. If it's the tables, las mesas, then you'll choose las. And then, of course, usually it's the más. Sometimes you can use the menos, and then the adjective. Now, there's a part that's here in parentheses. You only use that if you're going to make a complete sentence with it. For example, if you wanted to say that John is the tallest of the boys, I would say Juan es el más alto, and then of the boys would be de los niños. Okay? If I just want to say he's the tallest and not complete it, I could say es el más alto. Okay, so let's go ahead and practice a little bit. So we want to say nicest in Spanish. How do you say nicest? Remember, nice is simpático. And then, of course, the adjective also has to agree with the noun being compared. So for the nicest, we would have el más simpático, la más simpática, los más simpáticos, or las más simpáticas, simply depending on the noun that you're using to make your comparison. So let's look at the formula again, and let's come up with an example where we use this information that's in the parentheses. If I wanted to say the nicest of the boys, and for the boys we'll use los chicos. So I pick one boy and I want to say, well, he's the nicest of the boys. The nicest of the boys would be what? ¿Cómo se dice? The nicest of the boys. El más simpático de los chicos. El más simpático de los chicos. An alternative way you can do this is you could say, for example, if there's three boys that you're comparing and you pick one, you might say el más simpático de los tres, the nicest of the three. Or if you want to say the nicest of all of them, then you could say el más simpático de todos. El más simpático de todos. Let's try another one. The biggest. The biggest. How would you say the biggest? So we have grande as your adjective. This will either be el más grande, la más grande, los más grandes, or las más grandes, depending on your noun. The smallest, ¿cómo se dice the smallest? El más pequeño, la más pequeña, los más pequeños, or las más pequeñas. Remember, we start with pequeño, and then más pequeño would be smaller, and then the smallest would be el más pequeño for the masculine. I think it's helpful to see the adjective. This is the adjective, then we have the comparative, and then the superlative. So again, small, pequeño, smaller, más pequeño, and then the smallest, el más pequeño. There are a few irregular superlatives, and if you watch my video about the comparatives, the irregular comparatives are also the irregular superlatives. So for the best, the worst, the oldest, the youngest, in Spanish, these will be el mejor, the best, la mejor, los mejores, or las mejores. And again, I think it helps if you see the range of the adjective, comparative, and superlative. So we would have bueno is good, mejor is better, and el mejor or la mejor would be the best. For the worst, we have el peor, la peor, los peores, or las peores. And then again, I think it's helpful if you see the range here. We start with our adjective malo, and the comparative is irregular, so we have peor, and then the worst for the masculine would be el peor. So bad, worse, and worst. Malo, peor, el peor. For oldest, we start with viejo, then we go to mayor, and then el mayor for the range. So we have el mayor, la mayor, los mayores, or las mayores, meaning the oldest. And then for the youngest, we have el menor, la menor, los menores, las menores. Can you guess the range? So we start with young, which is joven. Okay, so we put that in there. What would be next? Younger would be menor. Remember menor or menor que. And the youngest would be, for masculine, el menor. So now that you understand how things work, let's try to come up with some examples just here on the fly using these adjectives. Pues vamos. Okay. So the first one, how about if we say, Pedro is the poorest. Pedro is the poorest. Pedro es el más pobre. Pedro es el más pobre. Juan is the richest. Juan is the richest. Juan es el más rico, or maybe Maria is the richest. Maria es la más rica. The professor is the most generous. The most generous. El profesor es el más generoso. El profesor es el más generoso. Luis is the stingiest. Luis es el más tacaño. Or let's try two people now. How would you say Luis and Pedro are the stingiest? What do you think? Luis y Pedro son los más tacaños. Luis y Pedro son los más tacaños. Jaime is the most hardworking. Jaime es el más trabajador. Jaime es el más trabajador. Ana is the most hardworking. Ana es la más trabajadora. Ana es la más trabajadora. The professor is the most patient. Let's use la profesora for this one. La profesora es la más paciente. How about for this one a subject pronoun instead of a noun? He is the most humble. Él es el más humilde. She is the most humble. Ella es la más humilde. It's the most interesting. Es el más interesante. Es el más interesante. This class is the most boring. Esta clase es la más aburrida. Es la más aburrida. Or if you wanted to say it's the least boring, esta clase es la menos aburrida. Esta clase es la menos aburrida. Okay, well, now that you understand how all this works, just force yourself to practice as much as possible. It's the only way to build the skill. All right, well, that's the end of this video. Nos vemos en clase. Adiós.